Hello, dear audience. I think I'm not late. If you are the one subscriber I still have, thank you. You get the front row. Tonight's story begins small. A single rent increase, a single tenant pushed to the edge, and then it explodes into a $2 million uncovering that nobody saw coming. This is the story of Maria Alvarez, a single mother working 2 jobs, and of a landlord whose sharp raise began as a number on a page and ended as a revelation that rattled a whole community. It's about laws, loopholes, courage, and the kinds of quiet detective work that actually change lives. Maria moved into a modest 3-bedroom apartment on the edge of a mid-sized American city. She paid her rent on time for 6 years. She took her son to soccer practice, cooked dinner after second shifts, and never missed a landlord email. The building was old but functional. The landlord, well known in the neighborhood, a property manager named Alan Pierce. Then, one spring morning, Maria opened an email that changed everything. The subject line read, "Rent Adjustment Notice." The message was short and clinical. Beginning next month, your rent will increase by 30%. 30%. For a single mom on a fixed hourly income, 30% is not a line item, it is survival. It meant choosing between rent and medicine, between keeping the lights on and making sure her son had shoes for school. Maria called the landlord immediately. She explained her budget, her history of timeliness, and the impossibility of that increase. The landlord's reply was brief. Market adjustment. No exceptions. Maria pleaded. The tone was friendly but immovable. No negotiation, no empathy. Just a new number and an expectation she would comply. Desperate, Maria called a cousin in the city, a man named Luis Alvarez, an attorney who had once tutored her in financial literacy and now worked special cases for tenants. Luis had a reputation for patient, meticulous work. When he heard Maria's story, his voice went quiet. "Give me everything, every notice, every email, every receipt. Don't sign anything. I'll look." Luis started where smart lawyers start, with documents. He pulled rental ledgers, county property records, tax filings, and corporate filings tied to Allen's management company. At first glance, the files were ordinary. Addresses, dates, maintenance invoices, but Luis liked to follow the money. 2 things caught his eye. First, the rent hikes over the previous 2 years were staggered and targeted, not across the whole portfolio, but concentrated on long-term, low-income tenants. Second, certain invoices for capital improvements looked inflated and suspicious. Luis dug deeper. He noticed shell companies, small, newly formed LLCs appearing in the county property records. They were linked, through obscure filings, to a developer a decade earlier. The names changed, the addresses were PO boxes, but the pattern was eerily familiar, the sort of structure used to shift assets and liabilities in ways that hide true ownership. Those shell companies were billing Allen's company for property management services and maintenance. On paper, Allen's company was paying itself through these entities and then passing the costs on to tenants via rent increases. It was clever, if morally corrupt. Create a cost to justify higher rent and then claim that tenants must pay more to cover the revealed expenses. But Luis didn't stop there. He subpoenaed bank statements where he could, and he requested copies of contractor invoices. With each new file, a clearer picture began to emerge. A coordinated patchwork of shell firms, phony maintenance claims, and redirected funds, small flows here, larger flows there, that together looked like a laundering of income out of the buildings and into private pockets. Maria watched the legal work unfold with a mixture of hope and fear. This wasn't just about her rent anymore. Luis had found evidence that looked like a pattern of systemic exploitation, not only of Maria but of dozens of tenants in the same portfolio. The cliffhanger came when Luis alerted the tenant association to a shocking detail. The capital improvement invoices that justified the rent increases were often paid to companies owned by the landlord's mother-in-law, his college roommate, or a shell company registered at an address that matched a luxury condo the landlord owned across town. In a moment that felt like a twist in a legal thriller, Luis told Maria, "This isn't just greed. Someone is constructing an elaborate scheme to siphon rents out of the buildings. If we follow the trail, we're not going to stop at 30%. This could be millions." Maria felt the weight of that possibility settle in her chest. She had expected, at worst, a battle to keep her home. She hadn't imagined being at the center of a discovery that might reveal coordinated fraud. But the more they uncovered, the clearer one fact became. Landlords could hide behind paperwork, but paper trails often tell the truth if you know how to read them. And so the story widened. Luis assembled a team, a forensic accountant, 2 tenant witnesses, and a local journalist known for deep-dive investigations into housing. They began to map the scope, building by building, tenant by tenant, looking for similar patterns of sudden, unexplained rent increases followed by payments to the same network of companies. By the time Part 1 closes, the evidence had moved from suspicious to persuasive. What began as a single 30% increase on one tenant's rent now looked like a thread that could unravel into a $2 million scam. Luis leaned back in his office chair and said quietly, "If we're right, this is bigger than one landlord. This is fraud disguised as property management. We need to proceed carefully, because the men behind these transactions don't lose quietly."
Welcome back. If you stayed for Part 1, you already know the hook, a single rent hike that cracked open a hidden trail. Now, we go deeper. This is where patterns become proof, and proof becomes perilous for those under the microscope. Luis expanded the inquiry beyond Maria's building. He requested rent ledgers from neighboring properties, interviewed tenants who had experienced recent increases, and cross-referenced contractor names appearing on invoices. The forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Renee Patel, ran transaction data through analytics, looking for anomalies. Dr. Patel found them. Patterns lit up like a heat map. Small firms appeared to be paid for emergency repairs precisely after the landlord had raised rents. These firms then transferred significant portions of that income to a holding account with minimal explanation. Then the holding account paid out to luxury properties, to offshore accounts in jurisdictions with lax transparency, and to individuals connected by corporate records to the landlord's inner circle. Meanwhile, the journalist on the team, Nora Chen, began interviewing tenants. The stories were heartbreakingly predictable, notice after notice, each citing vague improvements or market adjustments. Tenants spoke of fear, of retaliation if they complained, and of landlords who relied on confusion rather than law to extract more rent. A key moment came when Nora found a retired maintenance worker who had once installed stair rails and patched roofs for the landlord's company. He agreed to talk on background. His testimony was simple but crucial. Many of the supposed capital improvements never happened, or were minor repairs billed at luxury project rates. He'd seen invoices for materials never used. He'd seen checks made out to non-existent firms. With that testimony, Luis felt the case move from circumstantial to prosecutable. He filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, with the Housing Authority, and with local law enforcement. He prepared a civil suit for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of a class of tenants. News of the investigation spread in the neighborhood. The landlord, Alan Pierce, responded with a public relations push. Clean invoices, testimonials from satisfied tenants, and a carefully worded statement claiming the increases were necessary to maintain the buildings. He hired a lawyer known for aggressive defenses in housing disputes. On a rainy Thursday, Luis and his team served Alan's company with discovery subpoenas. The company replied with dense reams of documents, many redacted. That redaction itself was informative. When asked for bank statements, the company produced long lists of transactions but blurred the recipient names. When asked for contractor licenses, the response included photocopies that look suspiciously similar to one another. The legal battle turned public in an ugly way. Alan's lawyer accused Luis of trying to bully a local business, and the landlord launched countersuits for defamation. Social media erupted with neighbor factions. Some rallied behind tenants, others called the investigation an overreach that would hurt property values. Then came a dramatic twist. A whistleblower, a junior accountant who had once worked for one of the shell companies, contacted Luis quietly. She handed over internal spreadsheets showing transfers between the shell companies and a luxury condominium purchase in the landlord's name. She explained how invoices were created after tenants paid the increased rent, as if the money first flowed into operating accounts and then was funneled out through a series of transactions to hide the ultimate beneficiary. It was exactly the smoking gun Luis needed. With the whistleblower's cooperation, the team created a timeline. Tenant rents increased, invoices appeared for improvements, shell companies received payments, funds moved offshore or into luxury asset purchases. Each step was a veil. Each veil, when lifted, revealed the same hand pulling the strings. The state attorney general's office assigned an investigator. For the first time, the case had official teeth. Agents began executing search warrants at corporate offices. They traced wiring instructions. They interviewed more employees. The landlord's demeanor shifted from confident to cautious. In the meantime, Maria's life continued in parallel. She attended court dates, met with the tenant class, and worried about making her next month's rent if the increase stood. Publicly, she was quiet and steady. Privately, she feared retaliation. She locked her mailbox, screen-printed copies of receipts, and kept a log of every conversation with the landlord. When the search warrants were executed, the agents found what Luis's team had suspected: copies of invoices, unsigned contracts, and emails that explicitly discussed creating management fees designed to justify adjustments. One email, dated months earlier, included a line that read plainly, "Past costs to tenants, minimal risk if we spread invoice names." At a pivotal press conference, the Attorney General announced an investigation into the landlord's company for fraud and false billing. The courtroom that followed pulsed with tension. Alan's defense tried to argue these were legitimate business practices. Luis's counsel replied, "If these practices are legal, then our laws need clearer teeth." But the human side of the story endangered the legal abstractions. Nora's articles highlighted tenant hardships: mothers missing medical appointments so they could work extra hours, older tenants forced into unpaid labor to avoid evictions, families split apart. Those narratives moved the public in a way cold numbers could not. The case evolved into a two-front battle: the civil case for restitution and the criminal inquiry for fraud. The potential liability, when tallied across dozens of affected tenants, the shuffled funds, and the offshore holdings, began to approach the staggering $2 million figure Luis had first suspected. That figure was not just math. It was a measure of lives disrupted. Each dollar traced back to renters who had been paying more, believing the increases were necessary. The investigation was more than accounting. It was accountability for an entire system that had let exploitation hide behind ordinary forms and legal jargon.
Thank you for returning to the final part. The criminal investigation gained momentum. Prosecutors charged several individuals connected to the Shell network with conspiracy and fraud. In the civil arena, Luis filed class action claims asserting breach of the landlord's fiduciary duties, fraudulent billing, and violations of tenant protection statutes. The courtroom became a theater of document and testimony. Witnesses testified about the invoices that never reflected actual work performed. Bank transfers were traced in graphic detail, wire after wire, wash after wash, until the flow led clearly back to accounts controlled or benefited by the landlord and his associates. At one dramatic moment, the whistleblower sat in the witness box. Her hands trembled as she explained how, under pressure, she had created fabricated invoices and signed off on phony payments. She described the pressure to make the books balance and how the culture of the company normalized that behavior. The defense tried to poke holes. They argued unfamiliar accounting practices, poor record-keeping, and business complexity. But the prosecution had constructed an irresistible narrative, a systematic design to extract rent increases by inventing costs and then moving the money to private holdings. The jury listened. Meanwhile, in civil court, Luis presented restitution calculations. He quantified tenant losses, the inflated charges, and costs incurred by desperate renters who scrambled to cover the new amounts. The numbers painted a stark picture of financial harm. The verdicts came in waves. Criminally, several defendants were found guilty of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. Civilly, the court ordered restitution to the tenant class and imposed punitive damages. The total, when combined, edged toward the $2 million mark investigators had first suspected. For Maria, the outcome was transformative. The court ordered the rent rescission for her and many other tenants. Payments taken in excess were declared refundable. The landlord's assets, including the luxury condo and several suspect accounts, were placed under restraint pending collection. But the court's remedy went beyond money. Judges required the management company to submit to oversight, to implement transparent billing practices, and to fund tenant education programs so future abuses could be spotted early. Local regulators launched compliance audits across other landlords, concerned the scheme might not be isolated. The human consequences were profound. Tenants who had teetered on the brink regained stability. Maria could plan for her son's school year without the looming threat of homelessness. Others rebuilt credit, regained security deposits, and avoided forced relocations. The neighborhood, which had felt overrun by quiet extraction, began to heal. There was also accountability. Several executives faced jail time or significant fines. Regulators disseminated new guidance on managing pass-through costs, and tenant unions grew stronger, armed with the knowledge that coordinated complaints and legal representation could stop predatory practices. The legal saga also sparked policy discussions. Local legislators proposed clearer statutes about allowable pass-throughs and stricter disclosure requirements for third-party maintenance contracts. Lawmakers considered penalties calibrated to deter such schemes on a larger scale. On a quieter level, everyday people learned lessons. Keep records, ask for receipts, compare invoices when you're told costs are passed through, reach out to tenant advocacy groups early, and know who your local regulators are. These steps may sound small, but they are the toolkit that turned a 30% rent increase into a $2 million recovery. Maria stands today at her son's back-to-school night, smiling because rent is under control and because she helped shine a light on a practice that victimized many. Luis sits in the crowd, quiet and satisfied, because for all the legal strategy, the human moment is what mattered. If this story moved you, share it with someone who rents or manages housing. Talk to your neighbors, ask questions. The systems that reward opacity can be defeated by clarity and courage. And to my one true subscriber, thank you for listening. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing for more real-life stories about consumer justice, housing rights, and everyday people who fight back. We'll keep following cases like this and translate them into clear, actionable guidance. Until next time, keep your records close, your questions louder than your fears, and remember that when people work together, injustice loses its power.